Well, hey fellers and fellettes, hope everybody's doing okay. First thing I want to dive into, I got this Chinese 372 from HUZTL. I don't know, it was last year around Thanksgiving last time, I think it was. I put the saw together and it's never really run quite right for me. First thing I started chasing was air leaks. Done quite a bit to make sure that that wasn't the case. I've probably put, I don't know, 3 or 4 different sets of seals in it. I've put a new coil in it in case it had something to do with the Holzfforma coil. That doesn't seem to be resolving issues. After talking with the Tin Man, and I sincerely doubt if you're here watching this, you're unaware of Tin Man saws, but just in case you aren't, you need to go check that channel out. I've learned a tremendous amount from that man. Proud to call him a friend. After discussing with him, he's had pretty terrible luck with most aftermarket carburetors. I have experienced the same. He's been through quite a few, a bunch more than I have. But anyway, I want to show you what we're dealing with here. So I've adjusted my high and low jet to what should be factory, at least get it to start settings. We'll see if it even starts. Choke on, switch on. High idle. Choke. Running out of fuel still. I feel like once you start getting out past 1.5 turns on the low jet, you should start thinking to yourself, we've got issues here. So let's see if we can tune. Okay, 2 full turns out. I do a lot more twisting on the needles and fiddling. It gets to a point where it sounds okay, but really, it never really ends up sounding that great. So I gotta let you guys in on a good laugh here. Seriously, as soon as you hit the record button on the camera, you're guaranteed to have some awesome things happen. So as we can see here, we got 1 stud, and how many studs do we need? So the vibration of the saw. Obviously I don't have a bar and chain on when I fired this up for you guys earlier. So vibration of the saw caused my stud to go suck back into the oil reservoir. So my brain immediately goes into worst case scenario mode. Do I really have to split the cases again? But no, we don't. That oil cap's gonna give me access straight through. I'll drop it through and suck it up tight with a bolt, and we'll carry on with life. Okay, minor crisis, and we're back to carrying on with life. Only sacrificed 1 bar nut to the chainsaw gods today, so that's a pretty good day so far. All right, I want to see if I can get this to tune. So let's see about it with a bar and chain. So again, I do some tweaking here and get it to where I think it sounds halfway decent, but it really still isn't quite right. Well, of course my tack doesn't work, and I'm out here at the wood pile. My shop is kind of on the other side of town, so I'd like it to come from idle up to full revs a little quicker than it is, but this is probably the best I've ever had this saw running. Let's put it in some wood and see what it does. Alright, so this is part of what we've been talking about, me and Tin Man, is just, and he's mentioned it in his videos too, a telltale sign that an aftermarket carburetor is no good for you is when you get it dialed in one day, you pick it up the next hour, the next day, and the tuning is just completely gone out of it. So you guys have kind of watched me chase my tail with this. I initially brought it back to 3/4 of a turnout on the high jet, which is where a lot of stock saws seem to really like to run. I am now back out to 3/4 of the turn. I've had the saw on some wood, so it's been under load. I'll piss rev it one time for you guys and you'll hear this thing's going way lean. So like a dog on a porcupine, I keep twisting and tweaking until I finally decide it's time to put on a new carb. Alright, we're going to try a different carburetor before I blow my saw up. I'm going to put that OEM like we talked about before. You'll notice a few goodies on those EPA carburetors when you buy them brand new. I have a couple goodies in here that look like that. I don't know if I can't see. Yeah, you got some caps that keep you from completely adjusting the needles on your carburetor. These just fell off. It's weird. I don't know how that happened. I recommend you fall yours off too. Okay, first thing you're going to want to do before you start disconnecting fuel lines, go ahead and vent your fuel tank, because there's a real good chance when you disconnect that fuel line you're going to go ahead and get sprayed in the face. Ask me how I know, because it certainly hasn't happened to me about, I don't know, a dozen times. Seems to me that's how I got to learn all my lessons. Several times and the hard way. Alright, so let's go ahead and pull our lines first. Make sure your mouth is wide open when you pull this fuel line off too. Well, that wasn't bad, just a few drops. Would like to put something in there to go ahead and cap that off though. Sometimes they'll just continue to weep on you the whole time you're working. Okay, I've loosened the bolts that run through the collar that goes around your rubber air boot that secure the carburetor in place. I've gone ahead and pulled the fuel line and the impulse. I've disconnected the choke. The last thing we've got here is the throttle cable. If you don't have several different types of hemostat in your shop, I can't recommend them enough. They are too useful a tool. And this carburetor is holding my throttle cable hostage here. Okay, we'll get that disconnected. Okay, I'm going to share something with you guys. Many people already know, but first of all, if you couldn't tell, I am an amateur. I am learning. One of the biggest reasons I'm doing this channel is to show that anybody can get into this, and you should. If you have any interest in it at all, get into it, get after it, start turning wrenches. It's the only way to learn, and I've learned a tremendous amount just from watching YouTube. I really don't have much of a mechanical background, but anyway. So this zip tie, this one right here, I added because as I was assembling this saw, I stretched my throttle cable just a little bit, because if you can see in here, right there, let me see if I can get an angle on it. Your throttle cable goes into, I don't know, I'll call it the trigger housing. I don't want to pull the trigger now, but this red sleeve needs to be pushed in to the plastic in your trigger assembly. If it is not, the lip of this red sleeve will hang up on the outside of that plastic housing in here, and you will stretch your throttle cable and your throttle will not work correctly. You'll notice that you either can't get full wide open throttle. Most of the time that's the symptom you're going to get. All right, I'm going to finish disconnecting this and we'll talk about the two different carburetors. Okay, so one of the stumbling points I had, this is our brand new OEM carburetor. Notice on your throttle connection here, your throttle assembly, this is bare metal. You've got this little plastic piece here. When you go to look for these online, the Walbro HD 12, you'll find that there are a few different variations. You'll also notice if you look up the Husqvarna part replacement number, they're all the same. One of the big differences you'll find is this little plastic piece may or may not be attached. Not to worry though. As I roll this over, you can see you need to pinch these two tabs together. Pull that piece of plastic off and put it on your new carburetor. Better view of that piece here. You'll notice it's actually got 4 tabs. So I just took a screwdriver and very carefully, the metal of your throttle assembly on the carburetor sits right where my index finger is right here. Just gently put a small flathead in there and pry it out. It'll pull those 4 tabs together and just gently work on it. You'll get it pulled out just fine. So you'll just take this piece, shove it right on there. Make sure she's nice and snug. All right, I'm gonna put this back on the saw. Some things I'm gonna be careful of before I reinstall this. I wanna make sure my mating surface of my air boot, my intake boot, right here is nice and clean. And I wanna examine the very ends of my lines, my impulse and my fuel line. I'm gonna check to make sure they're still pretty pliable, not overly so. Make sure there's no split ends. Just make sure things are clean going back together, especially on the cylinder end. I really want to avoid an air leak anywhere between my carburetor and the saw. If you guys haven't bought stock in this yet, you should, because I go through an awful lot of it. I have a feeling a bunch of you guys do too. All right. Mating surface is clean. So nice and clean on the face of the carburetor here. Okay, bolts ready to go. I find that I don't like to mess with taking the air horn, this portion off, any more than I have to, and most of the time I don't, so I don't. Try to keep things simple. Slide one bolt through. And 2 bolts through. On my 3 milli. All right, with any fastener on a saw, I'm not a fan of power tools. I want to feel them start with my hands. That way, if I notice anything doesn't feel right or some strange resistance, I can just go ahead and stop before I send it home and ruin all them little tiny threads. In this part, it's not a big deal. Getting one of these new aluminum collars from Farmer Tech, HUZTL, whatever you want to call them, that's easy. When you're when you're putting fasteners into and out of a cylinder, that's when it's time to pay attention, in my opinion. Or into the case of the saw, especially, that magnesium can get a little bit soft. Now, I have a tendency to gorilla tighten things that don't need gorilla tightening. I'm gonna look at the space between my carburetor and that aluminum collar that I got from HUZTL and make sure that I close that gap so that that rubber's pushed up nice and tight to the carburetor. Should make a good seal. show you what I'm talking about. I'll take you around here. I want to make good and sure that between the housing of my carburetor and this aluminum collar here that secures your intake boot to your carburetor, that piece of rubber comes through here. There's a stiffener on the inside of this. You guys probably caught a view of that earlier, but I want to make sure this gap is closed. What you're seeing there is a little bit of the gasket from the carburetor here. So we've got this good and tight. I'm going to go ahead and reconnect my impulse fuel and my throttle cable. I want to show you guys a few things with this throttle cable. These 372s can really be a pain. Now, when I go to route that throttle cable up through this channel, you get a better view of it here. Through this channel right here, and your little ball end comes to rest in here. I've got to pay very close attention, number one, to where the sheathing of my throttle cable is where it belongs. So number one, you're gonna have that sheathing come up into your collar here. You should see a little bit of red right there. And something that I'm going to be looking at very closely. It's difficult to get my camera in here. I can't really get a good angle on it. Okay, that looks better, I think. If you look in there, you'll see where the sheath of that throttle goes into some gray plastic that's part of your throttle trigger assembly. I noticed on mine it's dirty, so if that pulls out of that plastic, I will see clean red sheathing. That is not good. I need to make sure that I get that red sheathing pushed back into that gray trigger housing. Get you a better look of where your throttle cable sheathing comes into your trigger assembly. There you go. Now you see how that sheathing slides into your trigger there. So I know that I did this correctly because I am coming back to rest on the idle screw. See it coming back, so my idle screw then becomes effective. And when I crank this thing open, it's wide open throttle. And I need 3 hands to show you that. Well, maybe I can reach it with my thumb here. Okay, so what I'm doing, I'm holding the trigger down here with my ring finger, and I'm gonna attempt to push my my throttle mechanism on the carburetor, and it's wide open. So we have full range of motion with our throttle assembly. That's what we're looking for. Let's start this, see what she does. I don't want to be skipping steps first. I've reconnected our choke. You see that in here. Let me get a better view. Yep. So all you do is to disassemble your choke, take a set of pliers or hemostats, pinch those 2 tabs together and move it out to your right. Comes out easy enough. Fuel line, impulse line. The ends look good. Throttle cable's good. Gap between my intake boot, collar, and my carburetor housing, nice and tight. Not gorilla tight to the point where I'm stripping the threads in my collar here. Okay, now we'll start it. All right, here's another good one. This, I don't even know what these are called. I call them guides because they guide you from these ports on the outside of your saw into the needle adjustments and idle adjustment on your carburetor. This needs to go on before your top cover. Well, I guess it doesn't need to, but it does make life a lot easier. Okay, let's see where we're at. Switch is on. Like that. Okay, so remember when we were talking about me not being an expert before? I've got nothing to hide. And in fact, if anybody can learn from my idiocy, we're all the better for it. So in case you can't tell, I don't know if I can get a pointer in here. Let's see what I can do. Okay. That piece of brass right there, right at the tip. Yeah, that's your impulse that comes out of the cylinder. That's what runs the fuel pump in your carburetor, your fuel pump diaphragm. So what happens when you don't have your impulse line plugged into that is, I'm actually surprised this saw ran at all. Let's get that hook back up and I'll get back to you. And upon closer inspection yet, I don't feel like such an idiot. I didn't disconnect that line. That line up and split on me. You guys see that? Yeah, it split. So let that be a lesson. Some of the parts on these Chinese saws are okay and some of them are not. This hasn't been around long enough to split that like that. So we're gonna try, this isn't long enough for me to just cut the end off and try again. So I've got to come up with some different line. I'll bet you this runs a lot better when it actually has impulse.